What an amazing day this has been. The content is just blows my mind every year. Andrea Morgan Stanley has been a partner with Culture Shift now for, I want to say, 5 years. It's been a while. I won't keep everyone from the drinks in the next kind of iteration of the program, but we're excited to be a sponsor again this year. We want to double down on the fact that we're in it, we're supportive of founders of color and women in the entrepreneurial space. You should have on your tables, my colleague went around and put down little flyers, a little bit about what we're doing in this space, the Inclusive Ventures Lab, focused on investing in women and founders of color across various sectors. So we're writing checks. Make sure you scan the barcode, figure out what we're doing, come up and talk to one of us. Enjoy the rest of the conference. This is an amazing way for people to connect. We enjoy it every year, and we look forward to connecting with all of you.
Well, let's get ready to rumble. Good afternoon, you guys. We're here in beautiful Silicon Valley. People are writing checks. You're finding out what the checkbooks are, And so this is what this is all about inclusivity and getting to know each other and getting behind those doors where the information is that creates that what I like legacy and continuity, generational wealth. What happens in minority communities a lot is that you can't learn or can't get to the information that you need to scale up and grow up and glow up and all those words that people are using today in hashtags. So I want to say thanks to Morgan Stanley for sponsoring this. Again, this is very important that if you want to grow a community, you have to invest in that community, and Andrea brings the community together and the proper folks in to invest. So let's get this panel started. It's about entrepreneurs and exits. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I was born in Panama originally. That's why the name Armando, middle name Enrique. So imagine all of the imposter syndromes I've had being in a guy in a room with this name in the tech community. I started out in technology when I was 15. As a developer, as a network engineer, as a consultant, international consultant, and eventually I decided I was making money for a lot of other corporations because they never had to market me. And I said, wait a minute, if I'm doing this myself, why don't I make the money myself? And eventually my wife and I started a company that catered to the intelligence community, the National Security Agency, FBI, US Cyber Command, on and on and on. And then we exited that company. And there's a story in how we exited that company because we bought a couple of companies before we exited. And that's, to me, the moral of the story. Some of these folks here, a couple of us are from Baltimore, from Maryland, right?
Yeah,
and
there's
more going on in Baltimore than The Wire, okay? Everywhere in the world I go, what's like The Wire? It's like there's other stuff. There's more than crabs and wire, in the world. Like what is that? You know what I mean? There's success stories and entrepreneurships like what we're going to go here. So one of the first questions I'm going to start with you, my friend. I want you to tell your story. And then I'm going to go to the first question. I think we should all introduce our backgrounds. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you, Andrea, for creating this platform. It's incredible to be in front of so many amazing, diverse faces to tell these stories, because this is how we learn, quite frankly. My story, really, the real sort of brief version of it was I started my career as a lawyer, M&A attorney at DLA Piper, did about $250 million of transactions, also in-house counsel at State Farm. But saw the light. I knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Started 2 companies, not at the same time, but over a period of about 12 years. Both those companies I exited to Fortune 300 acquirers. The first one was a cybersecurity startup, and the second one was an enterprise SaaS product called Fixed. When I exited that business in 2020, I was one of 3 Black founders to reach an 8-figure or 9-figure exit. Still one of 5 or 6 to do that twice. And since then I've been investing, started a fund in earnest last year, and we're about halfway through a $50 million raise in our first fund. But that's not where I started, right? Where I started was in poverty. I'm from Bridgeport, Connecticut. I grew up in abject poverty, one of the worst housing projects on the planet, Pequanix housing projects. And every day in my project housing, I looked down and I saw Latimer Way, which is where Lewis Latimer did all of his work. Knowing that I wanted to do something more with my life. And 3 things really shaped my narrative arc. The first thing was my mom took us up on a tiny Cessna airplane. She had gone over to one of the pilots and asked them to help us, see part of, Connecticut and New York. And it was eye-opening for me. It was the first time I'd ever flown. It was the first time that, I'd ever, gone anywhere outside of my own city. And seeing my projects from that distance gave me the perspective that where I was wasn't who I was, right? So it unlocked me from, that narrative. The second thing that happened, was, I call this sort of the mud, right? Mud to magic, really, right? The mud was seeing my father go away to prison for 20 years, drugs and other things. Every male in my family locked up or dead, right? This is just the reality of growing up in the 90s in places like Bridgeport and Baltimore. And then lastly, I got into this program called NIFTY, Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, and I built solar-powered microwaves. I learned, all the science behind that stuff, and I made money, and it built healthy self-esteem, and it told me that I could do more with my life than, the options that I had in front of me. And so, for the entrepreneurs out there that are building, their wildest imaginative dreams, I tell them, to dream big, act small, and fill every unforgiving minute with 60 seconds of distance run.
Colin, what's your story?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Colin Wallace. I'm the managing director for Techstars here in Silicon Valley. We're the largest pre-seed investor, I believe, in the world. We do about 800 investments as a company a year. I do about 40 personally every year. And I started off basically my whole career as an entrepreneur. I got laid off from my first job, and I was building a software on the side. Crazy idea to let people order food from their phones. This is in 2006. And it turned out it wasn't so crazy. We ended up merging with another company, formed what became Grubhub, and in 2014 we went public, and I think we peaked around 14 billion as a company, and then got acquired by Just Eat Takeaway. Since then, I built a couple of companies, sort of like a whole slew of what gets wrapped up as exits, like soft landings. Like the way the stories get told is like very different, but finding a home for the things that you've built. But these days, I spend most of my time investing and just trying to help founders. I teach the entrepreneurship program at Stanford Business School, and I'm also from Baltimore region. I've largely ran through the gap that people like Clarence, built in that market. And just in terms of inflection points, I think I was very similar to a lot of the gentlemen up here, where I think the big epiphany for me was getting a scholarship to play lacrosse at a private school, having a classmate copy off of one of my math tests and feeling really unempowered to say anything about it, but also recognizing that classmate had a private jet and saying to myself, if they're copying off of my paper, I bet you one day I can at least buy a house. Yeah. Like, I should make that my goal. I'm gonna work really hard to make that my reality, and I think it turned out that I could do much more than that, but it was the first time I actually, to your point, changed their perspective, where you saw some glimpse of like what you could do. And I think, Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, they had sort of this saying that if you see it, you can be it. I didn't have the sort of verbiage for that at the time, but I mean, effectively that's what was happening, and so that was the big inflection point for me.
And you just had another exit recently.
Yeah, April of last year, we sold Zero Storefront to Thanks. It was called Zero Storefront. It was marketing automation for restaurants, which is a very tough business, actually. I've learned as an investor now there are easy businesses, there are easier and harder businesses, and I've chosen some of the harder ones to take on. But Clarence, say it, please.
Clarence, the legendary Clarence, and the fact that the circle is tighter than people know when you network in a room and you bring people together. Clarence is legendary in the Baltimore, Maryland entrepreneurship world. And as I was building my companies and the little companies that I bought, his name would come up around every corner, every backyard barbecue. Did you know Clarence Wooten? Do you know Clarence? Like, who is this guy? Who? And if today just last night, over cocktails we meet and we go through the Rolodex. That's an old term, and nobody uses that term anymore. Dates me. Well, it's something that's been replaced with technology. But anyway, how many people we knew who inspired us, how many companies were spawned from minority, and the whole thing about if you see it, you can be it, and the kings and the queens of minority enterprises, the Eddie and Sylvia Browns, and on, the people that we were talking about. But Clarence, tell your story.
First off, it's awesome to be here, and thank you all for sticking around. This is the very last panel. It's been a long day, but it's been a lot of brilliant speakers, so certainly appreciate that. Yeah, I absolutely feel like the OG on this panel. The two gentlemen to my right, I've known for years. I first met Colin, maybe he was in 6th grade, bopping around when I went to his dad's house. Because one of my first customers as an entrepreneur was Colin's dad. I think I designed his logo when I had a multimedia company way back when. I first met Luke when he showed up in Silicon Valley maybe 10 years ago to pitch me on an idea he had, and I told him it wouldn't work. Now, it wasn't the one that worked, thankfully. So obviously I didn't do too bad of a job there, but
We pivoted.
yes, yes. But you know, he didn't come to me with the second idea, so I'm still, you know, a little bummed about that, but it's all good. Luke and I actually share the same birthday. So a little bit about my story. I feel like I was born an entrepreneur. I was a kid in 11th grade with a business card, right? And to go back to how I arrived there and arrived here actually is not unlike a lot of African Americans who are in tech. And right now I'm a director and entrepreneur in resident at X, the Moonshot Factory, formerly known as Google X, where I now create companies for Alphabet. But I'll always have a side hustle because I'm a builder through and through. Going back to my story, I was born in Baltimore, and someone mentioned The Wire. I was born in The Wire. I was from a neighborhood called Walbrook Junction, where as a young black male, you pretty much have two choices. You can be a predator or you can be prey. It's as simple as that. Before I got out of elementary school, I was stuck up at gunpoint twice for my tennis shoes by kids in middle school. So we had to watch out for stick-up kids when the bell rang. You couldn't just walk home. It was not really a safe place. And so if you've all heard or read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, he paints a really good picture. Ta-Nehisi, I went to high school with his brother, and he's maybe about 4 or 5 years younger than me. But fortunately for me, my parents recognized that I was starting to become predatorial, and they needed to get me out of Baltimore City. So we somehow moved to a predominantly Jewish middle-class suburb where the saying goes, you can't be what you can't see. One, I didn't have to worry about being stuck up at gunpoint. But two, I recognized that my Jewish friends were living way differently than I was living. I remember getting invited to a friend's house, being in his backyard, swimming pool, caterers are coming over. I'd never even heard of a caterer. All I knew was potluck, right? Everybody bring a dish. But that made an impression on me, so I started asking questions, like, what does your dad do? Oh, my dad owns a CPA firm. And I started to realize, oh, wow, you can't own a CPA firm without going to college. So college is not optional. Thankfully, I was a pretty good athlete in high school, picked up a basketball, started to connect the dots. I made the decision at 16 I was going to be an employer, not an employee. Because the notion of a 9 to 5 sounded like torture for me. I was late for high school every day. And I was, my attitude was either I'm going to make it as an entrepreneur or I'm going to be a bum. And so, so that's pretty much what happened. I went to college. I ended up at Johns Hopkins. I studied architecture and then business. And immediately after undergrad, before I became addicted to the drug called the paycheck, I decided that I was going to start my first company. And I think 9 years later, I started a company called Image Cafe that was acquired 7 months after we launched for $23 million. And at the time, I was 28 years old, and it seemed like an overnight success story because Image Cafe, the founding and the exit happened really, really quickly, but it was really an overnight success story 9 years in the making, right? So when we talk about exits, there's a lot of failures between these exits. This would be a very interesting panel if we talked about those, but I want to be really, really clear that you typically learn from not being as successful, right? I've had a couple of exits now, and I've always learned when I failed. But the key is fail fast and fail cheap. Now, I could go on and suck up all the air out of this room because I've been doing this for so long, but I'm going to pass the mic back to...
Right, another August baby. I was like, August. Yeah, we discovered that about ourselves as well. June. He was June, okay. Get off the panel. No. What stone is that? Are you a Leo? Are you a lion?
Virgo.
Virgo. I know my wife's a
Virgo.
Virgo. So yeah, I'm a Leo. I was like in the early part of August. So look, having built a company and you talk about failure, failure does teach you things. I always tell young entrepreneurs, it's like you can learn from every failure, the ones you have and the ones that you could read about and the ones that you get told about. And if you're not paying attention, you will fail as well if you don't go take those lessons. But one of the things we talk about in the community, I'm still around in the Baltimore area, and I've relocated to Florida, but there's a lot of entrepreneurs, is what triggered the sale? The exit. Did you? And I'll start with you, Luke, because you hit a home run. And the way I describe things are, I always tell people I got a base hit, but damn, you got a home run. You went all the way. You didn't even slide. You didn't get dirty. It's a home plate. And you're a legend in Baltimore. And we Clarence and I were talking about some of the other entrepreneurs that were legends in terms of their exits, and some that should have exited and didn't, because there's a story about that as well. Because when your time comes, you get out before your time ends, and you have to learn when the ride's over. But what triggered your exit? Were you looking for it, or did somebody come knocking on your door?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating story, actually. But everything at this moment in my life is a home run, given where I come from, right? I got a $4 million commitment last week. I'm at Milken, and I get a $4 million commitment for my fund from a top 10 financial institution, right? On that same day, my cousin got sentenced to 3 years in prison. Wow. Right? He's already done, 3 or 4 stints in prison. And we were celebrating that. Because it's only 3 years, right? And so those are the realities that Black people have to live in oftentimes. Poor people, quite frankly, have to live in often. And you've got to be able to go make it happen yourself, whatever is out there. All the creativity, all the ingenuity we need to solve problems in our own communities is within us. It's in this room, those solutions. You heard Nate talking about that earlier. And I took that same attitude with me in December of 2019. I had raised $6.5 million. We were growing 300% year over year. Fix is an on-demand service. It's integrated into 8,000 T-Mobile stores today. Does over $500 million for the acquirer. Assurant, trades on the New York Stock Exchange. The day they acquired us, the stock was trading at about $90 a share. Within 7 months after the acquisition, after the additional revenue we added, the company was trading about $190 a share. That's $3 billion of market cap that we created, right? And so what really prompted me to sort of build this fund the way I'm building it now is like, oh, how many other entrepreneurs are like that, missing out on all of that additional value that they created, right? That's real value that if they're able to capture that, they can translate that to their communities, they can translate that to other hard problems that they want to solve. But to get to that exit in December 2019, I was running out of capital. Growing really quickly, raised about $6.5 million, all great investors like Charles Hudson from Precursor, who flew to Baltimore every 6 weeks for our board meetings. But I'm running out of cash, right? Running out of cash. What do you do? Well, CES was coming up, and I knew that Assurant was going to be there. I knew Assurion was going to be there. I knew eBay, Best Buy was going to be there. All potential acquirers for my business. So I had no money. We took a one-way flight out to Las Vegas. It's a true story. I flew on Southwest, middle seat, like back of the plane somewhere. I stayed at the Strat Hotel, which is like to this day still like $29 a night, right? I mean, I think the little like ride roller coaster off the building is like included in your room or whatever. And so I did this. I spent maybe $175 total for this trip.
Chalk lines on the floor, that's extra.
All of it. And so here I am, not sure, how this is going to go, but I was ready. Like Don Thompson was talking about earlier, understand what room you're in and how you got to show up in that room. I was prepared, right? I knew everything about Assurant, everything about Assurion. I've been tracking all of our conversations over the last 7 years of building the company. And again, I tell entrepreneurs to start at the end. You don't start a company and say, oh, okay, I'm just gonna go build, wildly into the future. No, you start at where you wanna end, and then you begin to sort of resolve some of those assumptions.
I call it reverse liquidity planning.
That's it, right? And so here I am, 1,000 people in this VIP reception that I'm not invited to, right, at all. I'm not invited to this. Hustle, I get to the door, I do my little magic, and I get my way in. right? Because I got to get in there. I got to get in there and make it happen. I don't know if it's going to actually happen, but if I'm not at the table, then it's not going to happen 100%. So I beeline to the CEO, Alan Kohlberg, former Bain Capital president, really smart guy, UPenn, all that. All right, making $10 million bucks a year, as running a $10 billion company, and he doesn't know who I am. And I say, hey, Alan, I've had conversations with your team in the past, and this is what I do. I'm Luke. I'm the CEO, founder of Fixed, on-demand enterprise IT support for all your IoT devices. I mean, little did we know within 6 months of that we were going to be doing a lot of the COVID response for all those different vehicles that were delivering the vaccines, right? But this is still 3 months before COVID actually happened, right? So we're just on the precipice of COVID happening, and I'm sitting there having this conversation with him, trying desperately to get his time and attention focused on me, right? Because I'm running out of capital, and if I run out of capital, I've got 80 employees in Baltimore, some of whom I watched them over their 7 years have houses, build families, have kids, right? They're gonna lose, right? And so what am I gonna do? So what do CEOs wanna talk about? The first conversation I had with them, culture. Let's talk about my culture. 50% of my workforce is diverse, Black or Latinx, right? And I did that using these non-biased approaches. Here's how we think about resources, resourcefulness over heroics, right? I began to talk about our culture because CEOs at that altitude, that's what they want to talk about. That's what they care about, right? That's what's important. And so that bought me another 15 minutes, right? In another 15 minutes, I began to tell him about the structure and the texture of the enterprise mobility market, how it was $18 billion and how it was growing and how there were no solutions and how they had a right to win there, right? And 18 billion, I'm a $10 billion company. I need growth opportunities that matter. Because no, he doesn't care about a little $20 million growth opportunity. He cares about things that are growing at a pace commensurate with what is going to affect his stock. So within 30 days of that conversation, we were under a letter of intent to be acquired. And sort of the rest is history. But I was prepared in that moment. Thank you.
And Luke, you just by listening, yes, absolutely. Just by listening to your story, you were prepared. You had the nomenclature. You had the pursuit. You understood when you were running out of capital, so you knew how to work the room. A lot of the entrepreneurs that I've grown up, including myself, had to learn that from someone, how to operate in that room. What does a term sheet look like? What is the due diligence? What's a multiplier? And then, at least in the companies I was involved in, where I made a lot of people wealthy, until I decided to do it myself, it didn't give a damn about culture. That culture was gone within the statistic says 80% of the acquisitions fail. Okay, they bought those companies because they needed a revenue bump or they wanted an entry point into the marketplace. And in my community, where I grew the companies and bought the companies, it was the intelligence community, where less than 2% of the U.S. population could hold a top secret security clearance with a secret compartment and a polygraph. That's less than 2%. Now bring in people that are brown and Latinx and this, that, and the other. And at one point, the intelligence community didn't even take gay folks. You couldn't be gay and be in the intelligence community. That was a problem for them. Yeah, absolutely, full scope poly. You would not get into the intelligence community. So it was an exclusive club. But you were prepared. You were like,
my first exit was in cyber. The
okay,
first company I ever built was a cybersecurity
right.
startup, and we sold that. I am, but I also went to Babson and got my MBA there. Okay. But none of these things were taught in either of those places.
Stuff you can't learn in an MBA program. So tell me about your story, Colin.
Yeah,
Did someone knock on your door? You went like Luke, you went to Vegas and gambled.
No. It didn't look anything like that. So I just want to touch on one quick point, I think on Luke's point. I think one of the things that a lot of founders get wrong in this process is not recognizing at the end of the day, this is still sales. Right, and being clear about who your customer is and what they're buying. And what I see very often is a founder trying to sell their product to an investor, and they're not buying your product, they're buying your equity. And it's a very different sales process, and if you just understand that piece, then you can run that sales process the same way you would run any other process to sell any other thing. And so that's usually like where I see it go sideways. He understood very clear, they were buying culture, they're buying infrastructure, and they're buying revenue for future growth. And if you just hit those 3 points, you got the sale, right? And
that's just a master set of comments there. and it was almost like the panel with Renee and Don earlier about knowing what the conversation in the room is before you walk into the room. Because you could talk about culture and they're not interested in culture. They're interested in a revenue bump. So your sales pitch is completely wrong in that room, and you're going to get a no. Or if they're interested in a product, then you have to know that. And why would they be interested in your product before you walk? Clarence, like you're trying to say something.
Yeah, I was going to chime in on that. I mean, I want to provide some practical advice for all entrepreneurs in the room. The original question was, how did you go about being acquired, right? I think about acquisitions like selling a house, right? If someone knocks on your door and there's no for sale sign, that's a great opportunity. That's called an acquisition. When you put a sales sign out, you're selling your company. Both can be great, but when someone comes at you unsolicited, then that's usually going to be a greater outcome. So with that being said, if you're a startup and you're trying to be acquired, or you want somebody to knock on your door without having to ask, one of the best things you can do is try to partner with a bigger company. On the last panel, everyone talked about distribution being the king. For my first startup, it was called imagecafe.com. We were the world's first superstore of ready-made websites for small businesses. So very similar to what Wix and Squarespace does today, we pioneered that space in the late 90s. And the distribution was with a company called Network Solutions. They were the GoDaddy of that time. So you could not get a domain name without going to Network Solutions. And domain names are like building permits, and websites are like buildings. So if we wanted distribution, we wanted to partner with them. And so my goal, and I went to conferences, I called like you did, Luke, and people weren't taking my calls, but I had an angel investor who was with Bank Boston Robertson Stevenson. They had a conference. The executives at Network Solutions were speaking. I flew out here to San Francisco because at the time I was in the suburbs of Baltimore. Literally stalked those guys and started talking to them at that conference. And that ultimately led to an audience where I was able to really share how if Network Solutions also sold websites, because we had a website superstore. So literally you could buy a domain name and instantly select the website, that we could probably double their market cap pretty quickly. And they were a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company at that time. And I wanted them as a strategic investor. I was trying to do a Series A round, a $3 million A, which, before inflation, that actually meant something back then. And out of that came them wanting to buy the company, because we put together a presentation showing exactly how we were a puzzle piece that they were missing that could unlock more revenue through the distribution channel they already had in place. And they offered to buy the company, and I told them no. Now, the good news is something happened within my company. I had a near-death experience, not me personally, but the company did, because we almost ran out of cash. I wanted them to invest. And once I realized how precarious things could be, right? Literally, we were almost dead because we almost ran out of cash because the round didn't close in time. And I had just told Network Solutions' new CEO that I didn't want to sell them the company just yet, or not at all, a couple months prior. So I then went back and said, well, maybe I might want to sell this company. I looked at my daughter at the time, who was 6 months old. I didn't come from any money. I wanted to secure her future. And this was probably the summer of 1999. And ultimately, it turned into that acquisition. And thank God it did, because 6 months after the acquisition, there was this whole thing called the dot-com bubble popping. And my company probably would have gone to zero. So that was the first one. I don't know if we even have enough time for me to talk about the second one, but it's all kinds of
I lived through
ways
that.
these
I
things
saw a
can
lot
go.
of entrepreneurs who lost a lot of equity and businesses that went out during that dot-com bubble. We all remember those companies that were around the Beltway there in Northern Virginia, which is now, the big mall there, and Reston, and some companies, was it MCM or whatever, MCI. I used to know the executives there, like what happened there, when that bubble burst, and some of the companies, and this right here where we are. So each of you, but go Colin, because you didn't get to tell.
It's okay. I was just going to add one quick thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not going to tell my story, but one of the common threads, I think, between all of us is the power and the importance of capital and cash flows. Right, and in my case, even, it was a very similar situation where it was like, ooh, do we have enough capital to make it to the next stop, or do we take this check? And it reminds me very much of like watching the Last Dance, the documentary, right, where there's this scene with Scottie Pippen, and they're like, Scottie, you only got $3 million, and Michael Jordan got this. Like, didn't you feel really upset and bad? And Scottie Pippen was like, hey, where I'm from, $3 million a year is a lot of money, and my whole family's depending on me, my whole way of life, and I have the opportunity to lock that in right now, irrespective of what the upside looks like, right? And because of that, you pull the trigger, you don't look back. And I think in all of our cases, we knew that the thing that we were selling was probably worth more than what we were getting, right? Like that's, and that's sort of the nature of it. And I had an advisor at the time. I remember bringing the deal to him. This guy, Sam Yegan, this amazing advisor. Sam says, there's 2 times you sell your business. The first is when you're overvalued, and the other is when you're completely screwed. Which one are you? And I remember not fully understanding what he was trying to teach me in that moment. And Sam had sold SparkNotes and OkCupid, and he had been the CEO of Matt. He had done all of these things. And I think he was trying to teach me a lesson in that moment I wasn't ready to hear. And that lesson was this idea of sort of positioning your life and positioning yourself to be able to take some of those risks. And sometimes it doesn't happen in one hop. Sometimes it's got to be the second or third or the fourth company that you got the sort of the gas to keep going, even when, before you would have had to turn off. So
That's interesting. In my story, I went and diluted the equity that my wife and I had. We had 100% ownership because we were growing so fast, and I was the chief marketer, the idea guy, the solutions guy, going into the intelligence community, going to the big companies. As a minority business, you sub first, and then eventually you start getting, your own thing. As Heavy D would say, we got our own thing, and but we diluted our equity because I didn't have enough time, and she didn't have time to go to the bank, get a line of credit, something that wouldn't have diluted our equity, but maybe that we couldn't even got that. So I brought on investors who, for cheap. So when we sold the company, their initial, $1 million or $2 million was exponentially, but you don't look back. Because that was sort of my lesson of pay attention to the whole business so that you know how to navigate. And then to the point of whether someone knocked on the door or not, in my case, yes, they knocked on the door because there are people who watch your industry, like know who watches you and watch them. And when you got to a certain milestone, the knock on the door came.
So
Go ahead.
Let me just chime in real quick, some real practical tips. Like what I tell entrepreneurs all the time, I'm an investor now, and I work with a bunch of corp dev offices to help them refine their processes so they can uncover more gems, right? But what I tell entrepreneurs right now in today's market, right, is to think big but act small, right? Like you should have all the ideas and big dreams and aspirations that your heart can expect to have, right? But act small, like build little tiny experiments that tell you and give you more information, right? And that process, what it's gonna do for you is it's gonna get your intuition in line with like your experience. Because what we miss oftentimes is that we don't trust our own intuition. And if something's off or doesn't feel right or a conversation, just trust that gut, but then go talk to somebody about it. Because Colin and Clarence can also tell you about all the various rubrics around like how much equity dilution, target dilution you should experience in a seed round versus a seed extension, seed plus, Series A, et cetera. That's all stuff you can learn, right? But whether or not to take this investor's money versus this other investor's money is a thing that only your intuition and your skill over time is going to teach you.
And would you guys agree that why are you taking that money? Is it to scale, or is it because of a cash crunch? Because that makes a difference of how you evaluate, that dollar that's coming across the table. To your point, it's either desperation or to get to that next stage.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
absolutely. Like, I think one of the big mistakes is that founders will think that the problems in their business are money problems, and they're not. Like, if you haven't talked to customers or you don't understand why your product's not retaining, like, those aren't money problems. You can throw money at that all day long, and it's not gonna make you go anywhere. It's sort of like, it's like a rocket ship. Like, if you fire the rocket and it's pointed at the ground, it doesn't matter that, it doesn't matter that you've got all that propulsion. You actually have to orient it right before you hit the sort of propulsion, okay? And so, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you were 100% correct. And that very thing is what led to the sale of my second company. Because I had a co-founder who thought we had product market fit and wanted to take out $8 million in venture capital and really scale up sales when we only had partial product market fit. right? And partial product market fit is like trying to pour water into a bucket filled with holes. It will just run out. And I complained about it, and you know, that has a whole nother backstory that I probably shouldn't go
It's
into
like,
right now.
if you're asking if you have product market fit, you don't have it.
That's
It's
exactly
like,
correct.
if you're
That's
wondering
exactly
about
correct.
it, you don't have it. Trust me.
No, you're spot on. And because we burned through that cash, we ended up selling the company to Box. It was called Progressly, and that was in 2018. And that company could have been a unicorn, but therein lies some of the challenges you have, because we talk about exits, but one of the things we hadn't talked about is co-founders and co-founder dynamics, because that can change the exit probability and the
You guys wanna
slope
go
of that
another
exit.
5 minutes?
Right. Yeah. Co-founders, board of directors, why are you bringing people onto your board and diluting equity or compensating, and what value is in that? You know, I grew a non-for-profit after, you know, I exited to $60 million, but what was interesting there was the board of directors. In my prior situation, it was the investors that I brought in. They didn't have controlling interest, but he who has the cash does have controlling interest. You know, I finally learned how to get to a bank, so I wouldn't continue to dilute my equity in my company. And one of the things I want to say in this extra 5 minutes, there's something unique. I travel, been all over the world, you know, and when people see you, or we're not used to seeing people of color, or hey, your hair, or whatever it is, you know, but there's, in our community, you know, from Baltimore, there's certain cultures. We talked about the Jewish community, and I grew up, you know, right, skip and a jump from the Jewish community, and we looked at that wealth and how that happened. In Baltimore right now, the trend is the Korean community. If you, in Ellicott City, they bought up all of Route 40. If you guys are familiar with that, that is now, you know, basically Korea. But the fact that they have their own bank, the fact that they finance their own businesses in their community. But what we do,
I think I got a comment that
Go-
could be
go ahead.
helpful, right?
Go
I
ahead.
think it can be helpful here, right? Like, I think what we as a society want to continue to do, and it's reflective in your comments, right, is that we want to keep exposing the world to the brilliance, not only the brilliance of Black people, right, but also the profitability and right, the economic opportunity that we present. Like, my exit produced $500 million of new revenue for this company. Their whole model is to grow through acquisitions, but they had never acquired a company led by, owned by, you know, founded by a Black person, a woman, any of that, right? And their 200-year history. And so I think that's the one thing. And then also I'd say this, as a founder, if you can think about exits at the beginning, right? At the very beginning, here's what the data says. And this is, you could argue a lot of things, but numbers don't lie. You get 3 to 4x in a multiple when you ultimately do exit, if you're building in that optionality at the beginning. So you get more if you start to think about these things now. And the last thing I'll say about the board composition, it's a thing that you're not gonna understand how to do initially, but through talking to lots of people, finding good advisors, right? You find your tribe not by, you know, going to find your tribe. You find your tribe by talking about your values and who you are and what things you're gonna stand for, and then your tribe finds you, right? And so when I was building my last company, my daughter, you know, who was 4 then, went into stage 4 cancer. That was within a month of building that first company, that second company, Fix, which I sold in 2020. And so, like, and I had great supportive investors that were highly supportive of me throughout that entire time. They said, we don't care about the money. Like, you take care of your family, make sure your daughter is good, right? And it gave me the time to apply to Techstars, right? And I got in. It gave me the time to raise that first 500 grand that you know, ultimately, you know, set us on the right trajectory.
But look, let me say this, because as entrepreneurs of color, and then we've exited, we're talking about multiples, and we're talking about raising capital, money, money, money. And that prior panel that was amazing to me about that, if it's just about money, you're probably going to have some defect or bring on defects, whether it's a bad board or you're doing a equity. What is your legacy from your exit? I'll tell you that growing my business got me to the White House because I was able to donate to the first African-American president, Barack Obama. I held a pre-presidential party during a congressional black caucus at a restaurant in DC because I had my own business.
You know,
I donated, but all the entrepreneurs that spun off, the impact I have in my community to the donations I was able to make, to the people I wanted to see get elected, the schools that I supported, but also taking care of my family. But I'll start with you. What was your legacy from these exits?
Yeah, you know, my career coincided with the formation of this thing called the web. And
Little thing.
fortunately, I came out of college right around the time Netscape had gone public. And I made that my career. Now, there was advantages and disadvantages. The advantages were I've been able to ride the wave of Web 1.0, 2.0, et cetera. Now we're in the whole AI revolution. The disadvantages were there were no African Americans in the web industry that had come before me. So I had no web mentors because even the non-African Americans were all new to this industry called the web. And fortunately for me, I became a student of how Silicon Valley worked. I've learned that I'm autodidactic, which is a word I did not know until a couple of years ago. That means you're constantly self-learning, right? So you're a constant student. You're constantly teaching yourself something, and you have to be that as an entrepreneur. But back to your question about legacy, I think my biggest legacy is being the mentor that I didn't have to other young entrepreneurs in the tech space, particularly African American entrepreneurs. And it's so funny because when Luke first met me, he learned about me in his business school class at Babson.
Wow. Yeah, it was a case study. Yep. I was sitting in business school in 2009 at Babson, #1 school for entrepreneurship. Didn't teach me any of this shit. But I'm sitting in my business school class and this guy comes on and I'm bored, right? I'm, whatever. And then he starts talking, and I'm like, okay, he got the timing right. He's talking about his exit. I start, leaning in even more, and he says he's from Baltimore. I'm like, I live in Baltimore. I've been in Baltimore 22 years. It's the longest place I've ever lived anywhere. And I said, I gotta go find this guy. So I reached out to him. He ignored my first 5 emails, and then eventually, became very, very good friends. And
I should have found him. All those backyard
You
barbecues where
should've.
his name was being mentioned.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, sure. I can just say two things. I think, look, one, my legacy has definitely been this ripple effect that you start. That's leverage of both capital, your time, your insights. People have done it for me. I'm doing it for hundreds of founders and as many as I possibly can. It's literally what I get up and do all day, every day, is try and help them achieve the same things for their community, for their family, for their children that people helped me, like Luke, like Clarence, like my parents, and so on. And so I think there's this element of giving first and sort of paying it forward. I think each of you should feel empowered to reach out. You don't owe anything to us, like to go and ask. We do it because somebody else did it for us. And I think in many cases, for many of you, you're in the front of the pack, and that means a lot of the people who are in front of you, they're not gonna look like you. They're not gonna come from the same environment. And so being comfortable crossing that barrier and saying, hey, I know we're not from the same community, but I need some help. Can you give me some guidance? Can you give me some advice? Because many of those people will surprise you at how far back they will reach to grab you and not just be investors in your business, but be backers in your life and what you're trying to accomplish. And so I encourage every one of you to go out and engage people along those lines. So thanks for having us.
And my last, sort of little bit there, amazing. And me and Colin didn't even talk about the boards that we've been on together, supporting companies, giving first, right? But I think my legacy will be, bringing the common to the crown, right? I'm from poverty, and there's a bunch of people like me, right? 30% of Baltimore lives at or below the poverty line, right? 90,000 residents don't have internet access. Like we have 300 murders a year, right? I'm completely traumatized by that, right? And but I think the more that we can understand each other's worlds, communities, the things that truly matter in life, the more we can bring that common and crown together.
Awesome. Give it up, give it up, give it up.